To anyone who just joined, we're just giving it about another 30 seconds so folks can have time to join, and then we'll get started in about a minute. Okay, so welcome to today's Quincy Institute panel, 19 years after the invasion, a reflection on the US military presence in Iraq. My name is Adam Weinstein, and I'm a research fellow at the Quincy Institute. And if you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute works to create a more peaceful US foreign policy and world by centering diplomacy over the kind of military intervention that we've seen dominate the US foreign policy space over the last couple decades. And of course, the invasion of Iraq using weapons of mass destruction as a pretense is the quintessential example of the kind of unhinged interventionist foreign policy that has dominated over the last several decades. So today we are joined by a distinguished panel, and we're going to explore the legacy of the Iraq War on different communities, including vets who served in Iraq, Iraqis who lived through the war in Iraq, other members of the veterans community who were family members of veterans, and so forth. And I'd like to take about 10 seconds just to have a moment of silence to remember the 4,418 US service members killed in Operation Iraqi Freedom, the other 107 killed in Operation Inherent Resolve, and the approximately 200,000 Iraqis, most of whom were civilians, killed throughout the war. And I think this 10 seconds will allow us to remember that the policy we discuss has real life implications for people. Thank you for observing that very brief moment of silence with me. Without further delay, I'm going to introduce our panel. We have Naveed Shah. Naveed is a veteran of the US Army in Operation Iraqi Freedom. And after serving on active duty for 4 years, including a 12-month tour in Iraq, he returned to Virginia and became involved in the veterans community. In 2016, the First Lady invited Naveed to attend President Obama's final State of the Union address in recognition of his years of work on veterans issues. He has also worked with the Virginia Democratic Party's Mission First initiative to get veterans and military families involved in the political process. He now works with Common Defense, and he joined in 2019. Next, we have Joanna Sweat, who served in the US Marine Corps from 1998 to 2007 and deployed in 2003 in the initial invasion of Iraq. And she is deeply involved in Arizona politics, and she's a vocal veteran advocate in that state. She is also a freelance writer for Freedom Sisters magazine and has been featured in Vice News, PBS, New York Times, and McClatchy DC Bureau. In addition, we have Dan Caldwell. He's a veteran of the US Marine Corps and also Operation Iraqi Freedom, and he's the Vice President of Foreign Policy for Stand Together. He's also the Executive Director of Concerned Veterans for America. We also have Brandy Jones. Brandy Jones is the proud wife of a US Marine for nearly 2 decades. She's been volunteering in the veteran community and the active duty community throughout that time. She's been recognized as AFI Naval Postgraduate School Monterey's Military Spouse of the Year and a hero at home. And she is also the recipient of the Opening Doors Award from the Girl Scouts. And last but not least, we have Dina Al-Bayati, who is an international activist and independent consultant who has worked on an array of issues involving Iraq, special immigrant visas and US foreign policy. And she grew up in Iraq and lived through the first several years of the war. And as I said earlier, I am a research fellow at the Quincy Institute. So we're going to jump right into it. And I'm going to ask the veterans on the panel to just briefly tell us, what does the 19-year anniversary of this war mean to you? How has your perception of the war changed from before you deployed to after you deployed? And maybe tell us when you deployed to Iraq. And I'll start with Naveed.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I deployed to Iraq in 2009, and when I first enlisted way back in 2006, I was like, well, by the time I get done with training and everything, the war will be over, right? And here we are, almost 20 years later, still talking about it because we still have troops on the ground there. For me, my perception of it, even in the very beginning, was that the tenuous connection between Iraq and the war on terror, or even WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, didn't really make sense, and it didn't really connect why we were going over there. But I enlisted because when I was a kid and I saw 9/11 happen, I felt like it was my duty, my responsibility, especially, not only as an American, but especially as a Muslim American, to go and serve my country. As an immigrant, I came here when I was young, and I felt like I had to show people that, Muslims that had attacked our country were very different from regular Muslims that I knew, right, in my community in Springfield, Virginia. And so I had already made that choice. So it didn't weigh too much on that decision. But once we were there, I like to think, and still do, that we were there for each other, right? We were there for our comrades in arms. We were there to support each other in every way we could. Our enemy was not, the Iraqi people. It was only the person who was shooting at us at that moment. It wasn't every Iraqi that we saw, and it definitely wasn't even, the situation that we were in. It was just, if in that moment, that's what we had to do. And when I came home, it really weighed on me how much of an effect we had in the country, and I saw firsthand how much Iraq itself had changed because of America's military presence there. And when I was there in 2009 and 10, we were actually doing the withdrawal at that time, what we thought was going to be the final withdrawal. So I saw American military bases closed down. And I also saw Iraqi, leaders and business owners and people in their communities, like, almost upset that we were leaving. They felt that, America was providing at least an economic force there. So it was definitely a lot of mixed feelings that I had. And the more and more I've thought about it over the years, I realized how much, of an impact we've had, and how different it was than what I thought, 10, 12 years ago.
Indeed, there's, with these interventions, there's the impact of the initial intervention, the impact of the ongoing war, and then the impact of the inevitable withdrawal. And all three of these are traumatic for the countries that are the recipients of a US invasion. Dan, why don't you tell us about your experience in Iraq? I know you served there as a Marine.
So Naveed and I serviced in Iraq overlapped a bit. I deployed to Iraq with 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines towards the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009. And this was a time of transition in the war. It was at the tail end of the surge, and the status of forces agreement, which was signed in the last month of the Bush administration, was taking effect, which laid out a timeline for the withdrawal of most, but not all, American forces from Iraq. And so, we're sitting here on the 19th anniversary of the war. And I remember being a few months into my deployment with the 6-year anniversary. And the feeling then, and again, Naveed seemed to have the same feeling as well, was that this is good. This is ending, that this is, we're on a path to get out in about a year and a half. We're shutting down bases. We're winding this down. And a lot of people in my unit, in the Marine Corps and the Army at that time, were looking to Afghanistan. And that's what people were thinking about. We were actually shipping some of our equipment over to Afghanistan because they needed it more there. And of course, we're sitting here today at the 19th anniversary of the war, 13 years after that 6-year anniversary when I was in Iraq. And American forces are still in Iraq, and they're still under fire on a regular basis. And one thing that really hammered home the fact that this war had dragged on so long from, for our country and for the people of Iraq was that about a year and a half ago, I found out that a Marine that I had served with at Al Asad Air Base towards the end of our deployment. I mean, we'd done the work up together. We'd been, in the northern part of the country and then Al Anbar province, and we were at Al Asad Air Base, for the end of our deployment, getting ready to leave the country. I found out that his son was actually served at the same base that we were at, Al Asad Air Base, and that he had spent time there. And that for me really hit. It was something that really hit home for me and just emphasized the fact that this had been dragging on now for, at that point it was about 17 years. And the fact that it had gone on so long that the sons of the Marines in my platoon were now deploying was just incredible to me, especially considering where we were at in 2009, being on a path to withdrawal. And, for me, I think that when I think back on my deployment, this might sound kind of strange to some folks, but the feeling that we had was not only that it was ending, but it's like, hey, this might actually work. This thing might actually be held together. And there was a term being thrown around called Iraq good enough. And it was basically a result of we kind of lowered expectations for what we could expect out of the Iraqi security forces and the Iraqi government. And that, as a result of that, we had, tailored our training programs to those lowered expectations. We had done things, like essentially paying off former insurgents through the Sons of Iraq. And things were still bad, but they weren't, completely unstable, and the Iraqi security forces were somewhat competent. So leaving the country, you kind of had this feeling like, okay, it might work out. But 5 years later, everywhere that I served in Iraq, with the exception of Al Asad Air Base, was under the control of ISIS. And by that point, I had learned a lot about how we went to war in Iraq, the false justifications for that, the really bad thinking that undermined the decision, and really learned about the immense suffering that the Iraqi people had undergone, both before the war as a result of the American sanctions in the 1990s and early 2000s, as a result of the invasion and the occupation, and just seeing the images of everywhere I served, in effect under the control of ISIS, to me just really sealed the deal for me that this was a terrible war, and I would go as far as to say is a monstrous crime. And so that's kind of my experience and how my thinking really has evolved on this. And I just want to finally say that we talk about the top line numbers of about 4,500 American service members killed, another 30, 40,000 wounded. That doesn't include hundreds of thousands of service members that suffered as a result of service-connected disabilities, likely tens of thousands more that committed suicide as a result of the emotional injuries that resulted from their service. And the cost of this on our service members, the American people, and also the Iraqi people, is just immense. And sometimes I think that gets lost in the discussion here, is that the top line numbers really don't capture all of that.
Thanks for sharing all of that and putting things really into perspective. I want to take us back for a moment and hear from Joanna, who was in the initial phase of the U.S. war in Iraq.
Thank you for having me. In 2003, I was a part of the advanced movement to Iraq. We started in Kuwait. I was with Third Mom. And going over there initially, I think, setting aside fear, we had a mission, and 9/11 was still super fresh. That had just happened a couple of years ago before that. And everything from 9/11 was very fast tracked. So I just remember constantly being in fear of going to war. And then when it was evident that we were going, and then having to move so fast. So my experience was a little bit different since I'm part of the initial invasion. I don't know what's being broadcast back home. And I don't know what, I don't even know as a troop, right, what going into Iraq really means. I'm just there to do my job. And I'll tell you, being there initially, we were really, really proud of the work that we were doing, because of this idea that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and we were going to remove the evil and instill democracy. And what made us really proud was that we were able to rebuild an air base that allowed the invasion to happen and for the Marines to take Baghdad. And most of my trauma didn't start to happen until the end of my tour there. My father was a twice deployed Vietnam veteran, and whatever he was seeing back home was very triggering to him. It caused him his health. He was already suffering prior to me departing for the war from residual effects of his exposure to Agent Orange. And so my father actually passed away while I was at the end of my 6-month tour in Iraq. And I was sent home on a bird that was carrying back some of the first casualties of the war back to Kuwait. And I didn't even know I was put on a bird with these brave men and women until we landed. And I was told that we would stay on board until they removed our fellow brothers and sisters from the cargo. And at that point in time, I became aware that I was actually on a C-130 with casualties of war. And then I went home, and then I saw everything that was happening on television. But I was still a Marine. I then got assigned to recruiting duty, and then I became somebody who was enlisting people to go to this war. And I'm a mother of 3 children. And my 3 children were under the age of 10 when I deployed. And what's striking to me at this 19-year anniversary, like Dan said, is, when your child now can join the service and maybe fulfill a legacy tour, and you don't want them to, because that there is a long-standing war and there's seemingly no end. So as a mother, I fought tooth and nail to push my children in a whole nother direction. And so now a lot of my pride that I had when I was over there has been greatly compromised by a lot of the after effects. And just knowing, that this was a fallacy, in fact. And so still grappling with that. And I'm thankful that you're letting me get to speak today and share perspective.
Well, thank you for sharing those feelings and those that analysis, really, of what it meant to be over there in the initial invasion. And I want to jump off of things you've said, and also what Dan said about the after effects of the U.S. presence in Iraq. It's not just the approximately 4,000 service members who have died. It's the service members who have PTSD. It's the service members who have committed suicide, and it's the service members who have other mental health issues, or just simply trauma that might stay with them for the rest of their lives. And I think perhaps in the civilian community, there's this perception that this trauma is only related to combat, and we do have to remember that there's plenty of folks who served not in combat but still have these residual effects, because it costs a lot. It takes a huge toll on American families when you're being deployed multiple times for 12 months at a time. And to hear more about that, I want to bring in Brandy to discuss what it's been like to be part of a military family over the course of 20 years of continuous US war abroad.
Thank you for having me, Adam. Yeah, when my husband first left to the Iraq War, I remember thinking, how am I going to hear from him or when? There was no way to know if my children and myself would ever see him again. He would wrote his will. He kept a daily journal while he was deployed. And sometimes we thought that might be the only thing that we had left of him. So it was a very stressful time. The Iraq War lasted so long that my spouse served several tours. The first tour was a 6-month deployment in 2004, and the second tour was in 2009. That tour was so long that there was an R&R, as what they called it at the time, which was a respite care break. So after the 6 months in Iraq, he returned home for 2 weeks. And it was really hard to know what to say or do during that time. I mean, we just picked him up, the children and I, from the airport, or local airport. And when it was time for him to go back and return to Iraq, we took him back to the local airport, and there wasn't really a transitional period. And I remember thinking, what are the military members feeling? What are other families feeling in the same situation? And so that was a cost. Also, it wasn't the same as people who have lost loved ones, but there's definitely a weight to carrying that type of stress. Also, it was very isolating at times, being a military family during the Iraq War. I felt like I didn't have a sense of community, especially outside the gates of the base that we were living on. I would go to the post office and send out the care packages, and everyone else seemed to be moving along with their day. And I didn't, I felt very isolated. At one of our duty stations, the local elementary school had about 200 active duty military children attending, and there was no mention, acknowledgement of these children. And I created programs for those families and children at the school at that time, but I always wondered what happened to other families and children in that same situation who didn't have that help. And we're asked to deal with something that the potential cost is so big, but the connection to your day-to-day life is small, and balancing that mentally definitely has costs.
Thank you for sharing that. And we'll get back to explore some of these costs further, but I want to talk to Dina. And Dina, you're part of the generation of Iraqis that in theory should have benefited most from the US invasion of Iraq, if we accept Washington's official narrative of the US invasion of Iraq. And look, the numbers speak for themselves. I'm a veteran myself, and the military community in this country paid a high price for Iraq, but it simply pales in comparison to the price that the Iraqi people paid. The numbers are staggering. When I introduced the panel, I said approximately, because nobody really knows exactly how many Iraqis died in this conflict, but we know the numbers in the hundreds of thousands. So if you could enlighten us about what it was like to live through the initial invasion as a child in Iraq, and to live in, I think it was Baghdad that you were in during those very violent years when the insurgency really began to pick up speed.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for having me here and being alongside veterans. Just if I look back decades ago when I was a child, I would never believe that I would be even sitting here or just even being alongside veterans themselves. I was born in 1995, and in 2003, I was 8 years old in elementary school. Living, just like any other child. I didn't really like understand how an adult life was during the Saddam regime, but I did see the differences, like being in the school system and, you know, how like living basically under the, you know, the dictatorship. The day of 2003, the year of 2003, during the invasion, all that I remember was the siren sound. And as a child, was that siren sound always sticks in my mind. And even seeing the you know, current wars, it always triggers me. Looking back, not only being a child, but a person living in such situation with so many uncertainties. And I remember during that night, I was watching TV and I saw this commercial of this little girl who was with her grandfather planting in the garden. And there was an airstrike. And I remember the same night, I heard the siren sound and with continuous shootings and airstrikes. And all I had was, you know, hiding behind the closet and just covered, trying to sleep because that was my only safe haven, just to ignore the sounds because it kept going all night long. And I woke up the next morning, the windows were shattered, and we were one of the lucky houses that we didn't get an airstrike. But otherwise, I was just cleaning the broken glasses in the living room, downstairs, upstairs, and all I was thinking was, what's going to happen? Well, what is next? What is next for us? What is our future? One thing that we don't discuss much during the war is children. What is their experiences, especially young people, and what they go through, and living, you know, trying to survive everyday life, going to school, facing all the things that no child should face. This was our everyday thing. And growing up, I realized that we adapted to survive and we became numb to it. It was just, we became basically in survival mode, trying to survive every single day. And it just becomes an everyday thing. Oh, it's an explosion. Oh, it's a shooting, which is not right. But this is how it is living in this situation. And what caused after that, you know, after the aftermath of this, I always say war is never the answer, because no one wins in war, neither the US or Iraq, because what came after the war is so much destruction and pain on both sides. One experience that always taught me so much was with my interaction with the US soldier, when we had daily inspections by US soldiers who inspect houses. And I remember this one soldier, when they used to give us candy and stuff like that when they visit our homes. And one time, this one soldier I understood a little bit of his English, and he told me that he took out his pictures from his pocket of his family, and it was his wife and his children. And he said, I miss my family and I want to go back home. And he always is in my mind, because I wonder if he's okay and if he made it. Because I also, when I grew up, I understood that we didn't win, neither they won. And the aftermath that we're seeing today, the majority of Iraq right now is our young population. They're way different, which we'll also talk about more. And what they seek and what they ask is different from before, because Iraq has changed so much after the war, and new voices are there, but there's no light on it. So that's something that we could discuss further. But yeah, it's bringing so much memories that I cannot even fill in like one story or one book. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And you know, we've heard from all of you now about your experiences in Iraq, and although all of you come from very different backgrounds with very different experiences in relation to the war in Iraq, the common thread is just this this immense human cost, and it was based on it was precipitated by claims that turned out to be a lie, and there's no other way to put it. But I want to ask all of you an uncomfortable question, and it's a question that I hear a lot in Washington, which is that if you talk to folks in Washington, whether they be on the Hill or journalists, and including proponents of the invasion of Iraq, which was most of Washington, if we're really being honest, what you commonly hear is, yes, the WMDs were non-existent. Yes, we should have never invaded Iraq. Yes, there were massacres, there was torture at Abu Ghraib, there was immense human suffering. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died who didn't need to die. Yes, this unleashed the series of events and forces that produced groups like ISIS. But that's all done, and now we're there, and we might as well stay. And I guess, what is your answer to people who might be watching this panel and say, that these are all traumatic stories, but that's in the past, and it shouldn't have bearing on our policy today? Because that's what I sometimes hear in Washington. And I'll start with you, Dan. How would you answer that?
It's not in the past. There are Americans that are still under fire on a regular basis in Iraq. And there are still airstrikes in both Iraq and Syria. Some of the listeners probably know, but our military mission in Iraq and Syria is under the same operational banner, Operation Inherent Resolve. And in both countries, there is American troops still in active combat. I was just reading something today about how a group of soldiers in Syria that with the way the deployments work is that when soldiers and Marines deploy to Iraq, they usually spend 30 days in Iraq, 30 days in Syria, and then they go back to Kuwait. And you still have soldiers and Marines getting combat action badges and combat action ribbons, which denote that they were engaged in direct combat. So this is very much still an active conflict. And it's really unfortunate that there are people in Washington that want to refer to this in the past tense, including, unfortunately, the Biden administration, that wants to pretend that our deployments in Iraq and Syria are non-combat. Or you have mainly, neoconservative, but also even some liberal internationalist writers that are downplaying the scale of the combat, saying, oh, it's not that bad. It's just an occasional attack here or there. And, those people obviously have never had to live through an indirect rocket attack. They have never had to meet somebody who has suffered traumatic brain injury from being in the vicinity of one of those attacks. The rocket attack on Al Assad Air Base following the assassination of Qasem Soleimani had inflicted over 100 traumatic brain injuries. Those are lifelong injuries. Those are going to impact those service members for the rest of their life. And it really disgusts me. It really angers me that there are people that downplay that. And that doesn't even get into, the continuing impact on the Iraqi people. Even with these small presences at these bases, there are still impacts on the daily lives of the Iraqi people. And I want to be clear, the United States military goes out of its way when I was there, and I'm assuming now to minimize that disruption, but still it occurs. Convoys blocking regular traffic, accidentally tearing down power lines, accidentally driving through fields or getting in car accidents. It's still a disruptive presence. And at the end of the day, for me, it's not connected to our security. It is not necessary to secure America. There's no threat there. ISIS is defeated. We have a completely counterproductive mission, and there's no justification to me for keeping our forces there a minute longer.
Naveed, I want to go to you because Common Defense is a progressive veterans organization. And of course, progressives have a lot of issues these days that they care about. Why should progressive veterans and why should progressives writ large care about this issue when there's so many competing issues? Why should Americans in general, regardless of political affiliation, care about the fact that we're still in Iraq?
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, and I agree with some of what Dan said too, that the situation in Iraq is current, ongoing. It's not something that happened 20 years ago. The invasion started, and since then it's been a perpetual, conflict zone, and we are still sending people over there. I talk about this a lot, even in my own, family. I'm the only one on my side of the family who served. Obviously coming from an immigrant family, it's different for us. But for my wife's side of the family, both her parents were in the military, and my brother-in-law was in the army as well. And I served in Iraq years after her parents had deployed to Afghanistan, and there was a chance that my brother-in-law might have ended up serving over there as well. So there is a ongoing, very small group, unlike during the Vietnam era when we had a draft, a very small group of people who are continuously bearing the burden on the American side of all these deployments over and over again. And so the reason that progressives and veterans at large should care about the situation here is because we are spending billions on these conflicts, on sustaining these conflicts. And as Dan mentioned, the attack on al-Assad air base that injured so many troops, I think there was more than 100 who ended up suffering from traumatic brain injuries. Those kind of things aren't a one-off. Those kind of things, if they happen at a sustained pace, at any sort of sustained pace, that is years and years that we will, as a country, have to ensure that we care for these veterans when they come home. And that doesn't even go into at all the Iraqi civilians who will suffer at the hands, and not just directly at the hands of the U.S. military, whether it's by accidents or mistakes, but also there are frequently collateral damage because the insurgents, at the end of the day, and when they are targeting Americans, they don't care who else might be in the vicinity, because to them it just amplifies their attacks. For all of these reasons and more, we're essentially leaving our American troops there. I think last time I checked, there were about 2,500 troops still there who are in harm's way and essentially have targets painted on their backs. And at this point, what are we doing there? Are we providing security? Are we, providing any sort of real assistance, or are we there just for the sake of being there? If it's only inertia that's keeping us there, let's pull out, right? Let's get home. And to go back to something that Joanna mentioned earlier too, this conflict started, because of ultimately what turned out to be falsified evidence. And there was a very quick pivot. I think it was, right after the invasion, or maybe between 04 and 05, that I even saw, where all of a sudden Condoleezza Rice and even John Boehner were talking about, oh, well, now we're sowing the seeds of democracy. And I think George Bush said something like, the seeds of democracy, will grow a strong tree that will last for years. Is that really our job, right? Is that really America's role in this conflict or in this region? And I don't think it is. I think we have to think about where our role is and where we should be, what we should be doing and focusing on here at home, because there are millions of people here at home who are not benefiting from the fruits of democracy, let alone what we're trying to do in Iraq or elsewhere. So we have to really consider what our priorities are, and if it's easier to think about it from a human cost perspective in terms of the veterans, military families, and Iraqi civilians who are suffering, then that's the right way to think about it. But for some people, it's easier to think about it in terms of dollars and cents, and we're spending billions to sustain a conflict that we really had no business in being in the first place.
Yeah, and I think the human cost speaks for itself, but it is important to remember the economic cost. And whether you believe that money should have been spent on building universities or schools, or you think that money should have been sent back to the American taxpayer, regardless of what you think, that was the money of hardworking Americans, and it was spent, it was wasted. It was wasted. Now, I want to talk to Dina about what a future U.S. engagement and role in Iraq could look like. earlier you mentioned that it's a country with a large young population. It's a country, at least for the population or for the generation born in the 90s, they've never lived in an Iraq free from outside intervention. In fact, there's a question in the Q&A, and just a reminder to the viewers, you can submit a question in the Q&A. But one of the questions talks about the U.S. sanctions on Iraq in the 90s and asks how did that affect Iraqis? So we're dealing with a country where anyone who was born in the late 80s or 90s grew up in a state of permanent U.S. intervention of one kind or the other in the country. But Dina, offline, you've told me that what's really needed now is economic and diplomatic engagement more than U.S. boots on the ground. And I'm wondering if you can expand on that.
This is a very, very important question. One thing that has been not highlighted or not really shed any light on, very, very minimal light on, is basically the whole social movement that Iraq faced since October 2019. As you mentioned, that the majority of the Iraq population are young populations born in the 90s and the 80s. It's a very young country that was born into war. They really didn't have the chance to really live their life, except that thankfully, at some point, there was access to social media. The young generation is able to see what's going on Instagram, on Facebook, on YouTube. They see how the world lives, and they say, like, why can't we live this way? We have the rights to do that. The fundamental rights, basic fundamental rights after the U.S. invasion in Iraq were absent, such as, human rights, education, access to, everyday, like, health, fundamental services, like for every person. Because the people that were placed in the government, they do not represent the Iraqi people. They were placed by the U.S. They were selected by the U.S. And these people do not represent the country. They are corrupted thugs that run the country and have been sitting in their chairs for so long. They have nothing else to do. Just they send their children to Europe and other countries, spend their money that funded by the U.S. actually on their children and buy expensive things and and so on. So moving on, like to this young generation that's in the country, since October 2019, we had a social movement and uprising. The theme was that we want a homeland, and this homeland represents this country, represents these new faces. I was even surprised by the new faces that were there. Unfortunately, more than 800 protesters, as young as 12 years old, they were killed, they were shot and faced by live ammunition, tear gas, kidnappings, enforced disappearances, and more human rights violations. And all they were seeking is a homeland, and this homeland represents getting their fundamental rights, such as education, and the talents are there. The people, their creativity, they're very smart people in the country that try as much as possible to do their best, whether they work in labor jobs or striving to go to school. Unfortunately, economically, it's mostly public sectors, so there is not much dependence on the private sector in the country, such as tech companies, it could be, and so on. So when it comes to that aspect, this is when we say that what can the U.S. do better that's sustainable? Well, what's really going to help the country is listen to the people that are on the ground. This is very important, and just continue working with the same people that have been the main reason for the continuous corruption, and simply put it as impunity. Iraq suffers from impunity, but Iraqis no longer want to be labeled as a country of impunity and corruption. So diplomacy economic cooperation, education, civil society work. This is very important. The people are there. They have so much talents, language skills, but the resources and the tools, this is what's absent. And this is what's going to help the U.S. as they claim to be, as the human rights center of its foreign policy. Well, this is what's going to help for a sustainable future and also work for with the people that are actually currently will benefit from in the country.
Thanks for that, Dina. I want to ask a quick follow-up because, of course, there's some Iraqis who are particularly vulnerable, especially if the U.S. does leave Iraq in the future. And there is a special immigrant visa program in Iraq. And I'm wondering if you could just quickly shed some light on what your experience was with it and why it's so important that we don't just keep it on the back burner. I think our recent experience in Afghanistan should have made that clear, but I worry that we will just repeat the same mistake in Iraq.
So since it just the whole, I came through the SIV program because of my father's work with the U.S. and more than 100,000 Iraqis are stuck in the limbo of the refugee and immigration system, including the SIV program, which discontinued in 2014. Just recently, the State Department announced actually this month that they will restart the U.S. refugee admissions program, U.S. RAP, direct access program for U.S. affiliated Iraq. So this is a good start. It was actually a really good surprise. However, the Biden administration needs to make clear, work on the general infrastructure when it comes to refugee resettlement and the SIV program, because there is a big delay and backlog in the program because of the U.S. embassy situation in Iraq, and when it comes to the whole infrastructure that needs to be built again. So these 100,000 Iraqis are unfortunately still stuck in limbo, and actually by statistics, only 161 Iraqis were admitted through the program in fiscal year 2020, only 161. So there is a long way to go. And the people are, they are faced by a danger by militias and the security situation. So this is a big priority for the Biden administration.
Thank you for sharing that. If you could, well, I'd like to go around with everyone actually and ask this question. We're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq. And some of the organizations that are represented on this panel have advocated for a full US withdrawal from the country. And with that in mind, I'd like to ask each panelist, what would how would they envision US foreign policy towards Iraq and the US military presence in Iraq by the time we reach the 20th anniversary of the invasion? And Joanna, since you have the biggest bird's eye view of this conflict, since you were part of it from the very beginning, I'll start with you.
It's really hard to listen to Dina and her experiences there, because being a mom and understanding what war looks like and what that toll is, and for her to be 8 during that time, about the same age as my daughter was at that time, and she resembles her quite a bit as well. And so I would like people to really focus on the loss of our humanity that these wars have allowed to continue. I'm very frustrated with Washington because it's not their sacrifice. it's the people sacrifice in all the regions that are affected. I love that we have people like Dina here in the US telling her story, because that is the most impactful way that we can touch our audiences and touch people around the world to understand what the cost of war really is. And then when you look at all these years of no good results, really, it's hard not to say that this is wrong on so many levels. And we know that we cannot sacrifice humans to make life better for other humans. I mean, we've tried that so many times and it doesn't work. The investment has to be in the people that are affected. And we don't do a good job of that at all. We see how this country treats our veterans. So it's no surprise to us when we're the ones that have to raise our hands and fight for SIV visas and for people to be recognized that they're our allies and not our enemies. And those that are our enemies, it is our fault that they are our enemies. And an investment. If we can spend billions and billions of dollars on a war machine that has no positive results, that money can surely be reinvested in infrastructure, in the economy, in education, on both platforms that really brings us together. I really truly believe in service. And I know what service means now, post-military. It's not war. It's not going somewhere and telling people we're bringing you democracy, but we must destroy everything about your culture, your religion, and your livelihood. That is archaic. It just makes absolutely no sense to me. And we've seen, in the era of COVID, what it means to hunker down and be more human focused and provide aid and funding and what that looks like on the back end. So when I hear people talk about money, it disgusts me, because the money could always be spent in a way better vein that would not allow this kind of destruction across the world. And we're not even talking about the environmental and climate implications of what all these wars are doing across the country, which is further going to destroy humanity. And so our investment has to be in collaboration, in bridging our cultures, in bridging our experiences, our stories, hugging each other, saying, I'm sorry. I'm sure I gave candy to so many children in Iraq. Dina could have been one of them. And if I was there with money from America, that would have made me feel even better. But it wasn't, we were there to do horrible things. And we cannot continue as a country in doing this. And as progressives, that is what we argue about. And there's no benefit to war. Diplomacy, mediation. I mean, we talk about mediation in all of our professional lives and how important it is. And we do not mediate anything. We just take over. And that's really, the hard line for me. The same money invested in war can be the same money, dollar for dollar, invested in humanity. And we would not have these problems that we have across the world, because people would not have time to be recruited into terrorist organizations because they're thriving, because they have something to look forward to. And that's the world that I want to live in. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Joanna. And it is, it's always ironic to me when I look at the figures and we look at what's allocated to humanitarian aid versus defense spending in any of these conflicts. And, it's easy to look at the humanitarian aid in a vacuum and say, oh, look, that's a couple $100 million, that's so much. But then when you measure it against the defense spending, it's almost nothing. And it is tragic. I'm going to ask the remaining panelists to try to be brief, only because we have just a few minutes left. Naveed, if we have this panel again a year from now, what do you want to be talking about?
Thanks, Adam. And I'll try to be brief. I know we have just a few minutes left here, but to kind of go off of what Joanna said too, for me right now, it's impossible to think about and to not see the parallels between our initial invasion of Iraq and the invasion of the Ukraine, right? And we can see the difference just in the reaction from even the journalists, from regular people, in how they're reacting to the plight of the Ukrainian people and how they reacted to the plight of the Iraqi people years and years ago. There is a huge difference, and we can see that, and we understand why it is happening. And of course, it's not exactly the same situation, but the way I'm thinking about it, the way I'm framing it in my mind, is that there is a definite through line here, which is fossil fuels have been, really the driving force. The big reason why Europe was unable to do anything to really deter or stop Putin from his invasion of Ukraine is because they relied on Russia's gas pipelines, right? And so now, a year from now, what I would love to be able to talk about is the invasion of Ukraine ended, and the occupation of Ukraine never got a chance to start. What I hope is that we're not here similar to where we were in 2004 to 8, when we had the surge and we were going to send more troops in, because that was going to help tamp down the violence and make things better. And more importantly, for our subject tonight, I'm really hoping that President Biden will hear what people are saying and be able to make the decisions like he did with Afghanistan, to pull our troops out and bring them home, and not allow America to continue to be entrenched in these conflicts where we really have no business being.
Thanks for that. Brandy, I'm going to be a little more specific with you, and please be as brief as everyone else has been, just for the sake of time. What does when we leave these wars and we withdraw, it doesn't end for military families, and it doesn't end for veterans. What does the United States owe military families and veterans of these wars going forward?
Absolutely, Adam. I'd like to think that moving forward, our fellow Americans see our veterans as the heroes they are, not just on Veterans Day, but every day. There's families that are caring for people who've served our country, our heroes, and they need to be considered at all times when we're making decisions of war and peace. And we always think that Secure Families Initiative, diplomacy first, is always the answer.
Well, I appreciate that. And Dan, of course, you're affiliated with a veterans organization that is more conservative in its values, and yet, as diverse as the veteran community is, and while there are some veterans who certainly don't support ending these wars, on the whole, we see that most veterans are united when it comes to ending these wars that have been drawn out for nearly 2 decades. Why is that?
Well, I think that they have seen firsthand how endless wars abroad don't make us safer. And I don't think it is surprising that the veteran and military family community is the part of the population that is most opposed to more intervention abroad, that is more wary of, say, starting another war over, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it's not just because of their personal experience, it's because the community is relatively small and in some ways kind of contained, and it's their sons, it's their daughters, it's their fathers, brothers and sisters that are going over and fighting in these wars, and they feel it at a very personal level. And I just like to say, Adam, in response to your question of what should we be talking about in a year from now, there's part of me that kind of hopes that we don't have to do this. But the other part of me says, I do think it is important to do this, regardless of whether or not we have a presence in Iraq, because we need to keep reminding people of how we got here, and remind people of the lessons that we should learn from this. Because frankly, listening to the debate around Ukraine, sadly, not enough people have learned the lessons of the Iraq War, and that's why, I might go back and forth on what we should be talking about. At the very least, we shouldn't let people forget how we blundered into Iraq, and the price that we paid as a result of those mistakes.
Well, I think that says it all. I'm going to give the last word to Dina as the Iraqi American on this panel, and the person with the most skin in the game in Iraq. Dina, very briefly, and I'm sorry to force you to be brief, but what is your hope for Iraq in the next year?
This is a very difficult question for an Iraqi and also Iraqi American, because whenever we think about what can be better the next year, it always gets worse and worse. But the best thing that I could say is that Iraq is not old news anymore. And the hope for the future is that what could be done now by the US is really learn from its lessons, listening to the panelists talking about this right now. Let's learn from the lessons and what can be done differently, what can be done better. And that is seeing the progress for the future is by shifting the foreign policy to actually focus on human rights and listening to the people on the ground, because they are there and they want to be listened to. And this will really shift the conversation and the future of Iraq, at least step by step, because change takes time, especially in Iraq, after so much destruction, after so much pain. But it's definitely possible by taking the right steps and doing things differently. So that is my hope for the future.
Well, thanks to all of you. I'm left believing that we need, another 2 hours to discuss this, to even begin to get into the meat of this topic. And I think we'll have to have additional panels in the near future. But I really enjoyed learning from your lived experiences and such a diverse array of lived experiences. And I think it's important that when we discuss these policies going forward, we listen to people whose lives have been permanently impacted by past policy decisions and ongoing policy decisions, and that we always keep in mind that US foreign policy does not exist in a vacuum. It affects real people's lives. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for speaking today, and I'd like to thank everyone who attended for listening.